Five Nights at Freddy's 4 was the first FNAF game that was so confusing no one ever really managed to solve it. While the previous 3 games before it were solvable and had a simple enough story, FNAF 4 felt impossible to decode even more than 9 years later. Which is why today, I'll be compiling my best theories on Five Nights at Freddy's 4 and solving it once and for all for your viewing or listening pleasure, with remastered audio and more. I really wanted to put out a new video this week, but I think this one's a nice little break from my usual content and allows us to reflect on some past theories. So put on your headphones, relax, or multitask, whatever, and strap in, because today I'll be solving Five Nights at Freddy's 4. So let's start with our first subject, the box. FNAF 4 has a grand total of 8 nights to play through, 7 normal ones and a 420 mode where every animatronic is at its maximum difficulty. The first 7 nights all have cutscenes at the end of them, and while the first 6 show the story of the crying child and his eventual death at the hands, or should I say jaws, of Fredbear, the secret we see after beating night 7 seems completely different from anything we've seen before. The only thing you see in front of you is a locked box sitting in an empty void. There's only one thing you can do, rattle the locks on the box. But no matter how hard you try, it just won't open. Eventually, faded text appears above the box. Perhaps some things are best left forgotten. For now. Back then, the box was a huge deal. Scott Cawthon, the creator of the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, talked about it a lot and teased it everywhere, until 1 month after the release of FNAF 4, when he realized that no one was able to solve the story of this 4th installment. He was frustrated that even though the previous games had been solved in mere days, the answer to this one eluded the fanbase for a whole month. So he decided that some things are best left forgotten. Forever. The box disappeared from all FNAF media and stopped being relevant. Or did it? As it turns out, this box is present to some capacity in lots of the FNAF games after FNAF 4, and I have an idea of what's actually in it, and what I found will most likely shock you. But enough dramatic build-up. Let's start unboxing this mystery. There have been several ideas proposed by theorists about what the box should contain, and one of the most prominent ones is the idea that the box contains the corpse of the crying child we see in FNAF 4's minigames. For the uninitiated, the minigames we see after beating nights 1 through 6 in FNAF 4 tell us the story of a traumatized child who's terrified of the animatronics at the local Fredbear's family diner. Eventually, his bullying older brother stuffs him into the mouth of the main attraction, Fredbear, and the animatronic bites down on the kid's head.
Was that the bite of 87?
No, Mark, this is actually the bite of 83. This results in the kid's death in the hospital soon after. This child is most likely a member of the Afton family and thus one of William Afton's children. But why would people say that this thing contains a corpse? Well, at the end of the Night 6 minigame, someone who is believed to be William Afton vows to put the crying child back together. It would make sense for him to keep his kid's body hidden if he wanted to bring him back, not to attract attention to what he's doing. However, there are many more plausible theories, one of which posits that the box is actually a toy chest. If you're confused, let me explain. Throughout FNAF 4's minigames and even the nights themselves, it becomes pretty clear that toys are important in more ways than one. 2 of the animatronics mechanics in the nights, Nightmare Freddy's and Nightmare Foxy's, revolve around toys and you needing to keep an eye on them while they're in toy form. In the minigames, there are toys in literally every other screen, be it the ominous Fredbear Plush or a bunch of toys owned by random kids in the crying child's neighborhood. So if these toys are representative of the memory of the crying child in the eyes of his family, it would make sense that they would lock them away and try to forget the horrible tragedy that happened, hence the text, perhaps some things are best left forgotten, for now. However, there's more evidence that we can use when talking about this box. In a post made after the release of FNAF 4, Scott said that the box is the answer to the mystery at the heart of the game. Literally. Quote, "The box is the pieces put together." But like I said, no one put together said pieces. Or did they? Well, if Scott said they didn't, it's simple, they didn't. But Scott doesn't know that today, I'm in charge. I have a very different interpretation of what the box is. The box isn't a real box, but it still changes all the events we see take place in this franchise. Let me explain. I believe that the box we see after Night 7 belongs to Michael Afton, but not in the sense that he owns it or stores stuff in it, no. I believe that this box is inside Michael's brain. After Mike brings about the death of his younger brother, we see that he feels immensely guilty about it. In Sister Location, he's also extremely motivated to free his sister's soul, regardless of the extreme danger he's facing on a night-to-night basis. So if Michael is this motivated to help his siblings, it's clear that he would do his best to free their souls and give them peace. This is why he always comes back for another night in the FNAF games he's in. He's not a servant of William, he's acting of his own free will in an attempt to free his siblings. If he's so keen on doing this, there's almost definitely one thing driving him: guilt. guilt for the fact that his brother was killed by his own two hands, and possibly guilt for leaving his sister Elizabeth unattended, since Mike appears to be the family babysitter of the group. There are two clear representations of Michael's guilt in FNAF 4, so let's go over the first one, Nightmare Fredbear. Zetarox, a fellow FNAF YouTuber, pointed out in the comments of one of my videos that the reason Nightmare Fredbear has a stomach mouth could be because he's a twisted version of Michael's worst fears and regrets. This is because in FNAF 4 we play as Michael around the time he works at the FNAF 1 location, dreaming that he's dreaming a dream dreamt by Crying Child in FNAF 4. Yes, this franchise is confusing. Anyway, the stomach mouth would come from Circus Baby snatching up his sister, and Fredbear would come from the animatronic that he stuffed his little brother into. Looking back, this makes a whole lot of sense. If every single animatronic in FNAF 4 represents some kind of trauma or regret that Michael has, FNAF 4 is essentially Mike's living hell. I have an idea of what Nightmare Foxy is meant to represent, so go check out my short on that after this video. The second representation of Michael's guilt is the box. It's quite common for victims of extreme trauma or accidents to lock away their painful memories deep inside their brains, actually forgetting about them as their mind's way of protecting them, a defense instinct if you will. So if Mike is traumatized and broken over his actions, it would make sense that he would lock away his memories in a mental box and shove them into a corner of his subconscious that he himself would essentially be unable to access. This means that Michael Afton could be a victim of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. But remember how I brought up how the box appears in other FNAF games? Well, I think that's because Michael isn't the only one who has a box in his mind. In FNAF World's game files, we can see the box wide open. This image is never seen in the actual game. In FNAF 6, the shape of the map we see during the nights and in Henry's final speech has the same form as the box, with squares representing the corners, lines, and the lots. Bite Victim, whose soul FNAF World is likely trying to free, is pained because of his failed party and brutal death. Henry feels immense guilt for the part he played in the creation of Springtrap and the deaths of the kids William murdered. This box is only one of many. Every single character across the franchise has their own box. I believe this specific box after Night 7 belongs to Michael, since he's the one who brought about Crying Child's death and is essentially the main antagonist of the minigames. This is what I think Scott meant when he said 4 games, 1 story on the Scout Games website. He didn't mean that it was all a dream, but rather that Michael, racked with guilt, went to all of these establishments to try and free his brother because of what he did. All 4 original FNAF games combine into one story of pain, guilt, and death. Mike is the only reason all of this started, and the only reason most of the events in his franchise took place. As well as that, the color and font of the message above the box match up with Michael's lines in FNAF 4, further solidifying that this box is his, just like the nightmares we play through in FNAF 4. Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare are both representations of the guilt he feels for being unable to save his siblings. He's essentially living through his own personal hell, with twisted versions of the Fazbear animatronics him and his friends loved so much, stalking him down for his sins. Turns out William isn't the only one going through a hellish purgatory, so the only thing left for us to know is to find out if the box is still important. Personally, I think it's not. Scott himself said that he wouldn't open the box until someone solved FNAF 4. When people took more than a few weeks to do so, Scott gave up on the box entirely and cast it into the pit of scrapped ideas, together with all the other scrapped clues and leads from the previous games he'd given up on. I think the box is not important to solving the lore anymore. It's a neat detail hinting at Michael Afton's immense guilt, sure, but apart from a subtle psychological metaphor, it's utterly and completely irrelevant and unimportant. So in conclusion, I believe that this is the key to the original 4 FNAF games. It's one story of guilt, death, and depression being lived by one man, Michael Afton. Except for FNAF 2, we still don't know if he's in that game or not. Anyway, I believe that I've just unlocked the secret to the box, so now that I've solved FNAF 4, I can open it. Let's see what's inside. What? What? The Fredbear Plush. The plush has only appeared in 2 FNAF games, FNAF 4 and Sister Location. The majority of his appearances are in FNAF 4, with the one in Sister Location being an Easter egg. But what I really want to focus on today are the FNAF 4 minigames and the plush's significance in them. The plush appears in 5 different FNAF 4 minigames, the one before Night 1, the games on Nights 1 through 3, and the one after the 6th night. And he has quite a bit of dialogue, so since he's such a small character, no pun intended, I had to analyze these lines as closely as possible. So let's start by going over the story being told in the FNAF 4 minigames. In these minigames, we play as a crying child whose only friends are his plushies of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Fredbear. The Fredbear plush in particular is special. It speaks to the child and comforts him when he's bullied by his older brother. The strange thing about this plush is that it appears to be able to move on its own free will, following you as you traverse the path to the nearby Fredbear's family diner. On night 2, when you're actually at the diner, the plush isn't present, but you can hear his voice guiding you and giving you advice. So we can already tell that this thing is pretty weird, and it will probably have a tough time figuring this out, but that's never stopped me, and it definitely won't now. First off, the Fredbear Plush Easter egg and sister location hints at what this plush actually is. In the fake ending of that game, in the private room, we can see a realistic version of the Fredbear Plush next to a walkie-talkie. In that same room is a keypad that shows camera footage of the FNAF 4 rooms if the numbers 1, 9, 8, 3 are typed into it. Already, we can draw a conclusion that is solidified by the Five Nights at Freddy's Ultimate Guide. Someone is watching the crying child. And I have a pretty good idea of who that might be. His father, William Afton. So, a little bit of backstory is necessary here in case you don't know what I'm talking about. The crying child and his bullying older brother are thought to be William Afton's kids by 99.9% of the Fears community, myself included, with the older brother being Michael Afton. There are multiple reasons for this that I won't get into in this video, but if you want to see a video on that in the future, like this one so I know, or leave a comment. Anyway, why would William spy on his own kid, and are these Fredbear plushies actually cameras? To answer the first question, I think I might have an idea. I think that William is probably planting these cameras around Fredbear's to keep his son under control, and is making him go for these nightmare experiments to keep him away from the restaurants. But why would he do this? Well, theorists, I think it's because Crying Child saw something he wasn't supposed to, something William wanted to hide. The body of Charlotte Emily, the girl we see William murder in the Take K to the Children and Security Puppet minigames. In the latter minigame, we see the eponymous security puppet trying to save Charlotte, but ultimately shutting down next to her corpse and getting possessed by her. If this happened at Fredbear's, as hinted at by the slightly different Freddy sprite, possibly Fredbear, Crying Child could have seen the puppet next to Charlie and thought that it had killed her. Another FNAF theorist, Right Host, has said that they think Shadow Bonnie is an agony being, and the representation of the pain felt by Charlotte when she was killed. It materializes as Bonnie because that's who Charlie associates her killer, William, with, the spring Bonnie suit he'd wear while performing. Now, I know what you're thinking. Shadow Bonnie doesn't look like Spring Bonnie, he's more like Toy Bonnie, right? Good point, but if you look at the toy and Springlock models of Bonnie side by side, you can see there's lots of similarities. The three-toed feet, thinner build compared to the classics, similarly rounded ears, the list goes on and on. I think the reason Crying Child sees Charlie is because Shadow Bonnie led him to her. The Midnight Motorist minigames about the Aftons, which I believe to be the case, the footprints we see outside the house could be Shadow Bonnie's, explaining how there's only 2 of them. In FNAF 2, he stands straight up with his feet on one line. As well as that, his appearances in FNAF 3 and FNAF AR seem to confirm he's a force of good. So, what does all of this rambling have to do with the Fredbear plush? Well, if William knew the Crying Child had run away once and found something he shouldn't have, he'd want to keep tabs on him at all times, using multiple Fredbear plushies along the path to Fredbear's to make sure he could keep his son under control. The Fazbear Fright story, The Real Jake, is similar to this and helps solidify the idea that William is talking to Crying Child through the plush. In the story, Jake, a kid with a rare brain tumor, is bound to his room, with the only part of the day he looks forward to being bedtime, when he talks with his secret best friend Simon. Every night, Simon tells Jake that when he feels well enough, he should stand up and open the closet Simon is hidden in. It turns out Simon is actually Jake's dad Evan, who's abroad in the army pretending to be this imaginary friend to give his son hope. Eventually, Evan dies and Jake stops getting messages from the doll and the baby monitor he used to send the messages. The story ends with Jake dying and the closet door being wide open, the Simon doll and baby monitor nowhere to be seen. The parallels are obvious. A father pretending to be an imaginary friend to his son who dies at the end sounds all too familiar. However, there are several issues with the theory that William is the Fredbear plush. Firstly, we see William in the FNAF 4 minigames while the Fredbear plush is speaking to us. Secondly, why would William be saying all those things about the Crying Child being in danger at Fredbear's? This is why many have chosen to disregard this theory, but what other theories are there about the Fredbear plush? Well, the biggest chain of theories surrounding the plush is the idea that this thing is possessed. By who? Well, there's 2 big candidates, Charlotte Emily and the vengeful spirit, most likely Cassidy. There are 2 main points for this theory as far as I'm aware. Firstly, the plush is called the Possessed Fredbear plush, an official merch depicting it, and secondly, the dialogue on FNAF 4's 6 Nights seems to indicate that there's someone separate from the previous characters speaking to the Crying Child. Basically, if you beat the 4th game 6 Night, you unlock a secret 7th minigame where we see the Crying Child sitting alone in an empty void. Likely a hospital room fixed at the hospital imagery in the game and flat tone at the end, as his Fredbear plush consoles him and vows to put him back together. The problem theorists have with this minigame is a seemingly small but actually huge detail. When the Fredbear Plush speaks to the player, his dialogue appears as faded light yellow text. However, in every single one of the previous minigames, it appears as darker yellow text that isn't faded. Many use this as evidence that the plush isn't William but rather a spirit trying to help Crying Child to move on. Here's why I think this isn't the case. The merch evidence is really weak, and I have a much more compelling explanation for the change in text color. You see, I think the differing shades of yellow don't have anything to do with the character saying these lines, but rather how the Crying Child is hearing what's being said. If we're to assume William is speaking to his child for a walkie-talkie or baby monitor, which is very heavily implied by the real Jake and the private room and sister location, it makes sense that his voice would be more muffled since it would be distorted by the speakers on or inside the plush. When he's actually in the same room as Crying Child, like the hospital room after night 6, his voice is clearer, lighter, just like the color of the text. Instead of being important to the lore, the color is a mere stylistic choice used to convey that William is actually present in the room. As for why William is scaring his own son, it's for the reasons I explained earlier. He's scaring his son away from the Fazbear locations, either to protect himself or the company from any harm a blabbing child might cause. Thus, William is manipulating CC into doing his bidding. However, there's one last thing that might make the possibility of the Fredbear Plush being something else more likely. FNAF World. In this game, the plush feels like a much more protective entity, spreading clues to the various endings of the game. This seems very unlike William. I think it's possible Charlotte Emily, who's likely the mastermind behind FNAF World, is taking the form of the plush Crying Child loved so much while still alive, since I think the game is all about freeing CC's soul. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. We also catch a glimpse of what appears to be the Fredbear Plush in the second trailer for Into the Pit, which might debunk the theory that he's just an imaginary friend and nothing more. It's likely this was a widespread and mass-produced piece of Fazbear Entertainment merch, like the masks the bullies wear during the Bite of 83. But who knows, maybe it doesn't mean anything or will become hugely important. The Nightmares. Before we discuss the actual lore relevance of these characters, we should first discuss who they actually are and what FNAF games they appear in apart from FNAF 4. The core Nightmare animatronics from FNAF 4's base game are Nightmare Freddy and his Freddles, Nightmare Bonnie, Nightmare Chica and her Cupcake, Nightmare Foxy, Nightmare Fredbear, Nightmare, and Plushtrap. The Halloween edition of the game contains new reskinned versions of the characters, with Jacko Bonnie and Jacko Chica replacing the normal Bonnie and Chica, Nightmare Foxy being replaced by Nightmare Mangle, and Nightmare being replaced by Nightmare Rion, as well as Plushtrap becoming Nightmare Balloon Boy. I'll discuss the Halloween edition characters later, but for now I want to focus on the main Nightmare animatronics, their mechanics, and any lore they might reveal or the speculations around them. Nightmare Bonnie and Chica act just like their FNAF 1 counterparts, appearing from the left and the right hand sides of the room respectively. As I said earlier, Nightmare Foxy will enter your closet and progress through different phases, going from a plush to its animatronic form before jump scaring you if you don't watch him for long enough. Nightmare Freddy only appears if you let all of his free Freddles stay on your bed for long enough without using the flashlight on them, which will cause him to appear and instantly jump scare the player. Now, the last two of the core bunch of Nightmare animatronics are Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare, who replace the previous characters in later nights and pose a much larger threat. These two are the characters who I'll probably be talking the most about today. And then there's Plushtrap. Don't worry, I'll talk about him too. Plushtrap stars in his own minigame, Fun with Plushtrap, that you can play before every night. If you successfully manage to get Plushtrap stunned on the cross in the middle of the room using your flashlight, you get to skip 2 hours ahead on your next in-game night. Additionally, before I talk about the lore surrounding these characters, I want to explain where the nightmares come from, why they exist, and who's playing through FNAF 4. For a long time, theorists believed that these characters were either actual nightmares being had by Crying Child before or after the Bite of 83, or a group of William Afton's creations powered by illusion discs, a piece of Afton Robotics tech from the books that utilizes sound waves to change an object or person's appearance. However, with the release of the last Tales from the Pizzaplex book, B72, it quickly became clear that neither of these theories was actually the case. In the story Ditophobia, a 7-year-old boy called Rory is trapped in his house, unable to find an exit, and ends up having the same nightmare about a bunch of terrifying robot animals hunting him down over and over again. One day he hears the sound of an engine failing and starts exploring the house. He soon realizes that this isn't actually his home. It's an experiment chamber filled to the brim of a nightmare-inducing gas that made him believe the things hunting after him were horrifying monstrosities, when they were actually just mannequins on rails, with the house containing the bare minimum of food and water necessary for him to survive. Eventually, he manages to use his old walkie-talkie to contact one of his childhood friends, who reveals Rory's been missing for 10 years after he ran away from home, meaning that he's 17, not 7 like he thought he was while in the experiment. As he explores, he finds an empty, high-tech underground bunker as well as some animatronic pieces, and eventually hears a soothing middle-aged man's voice telling him to turn the engine back on and that the experiment chamber is his home. Rory does so, and everything goes back to how it was, as the old tape recorder on the roof of the building clicks off. Take 1. This story made it extremely clear that this is what FNAF 4's gameplay is all about, some kind of experiment chamber. And this idea isn't new. In sister location, the Breaker Room map has the Circus Baby Entertainment and Rentals bunker directly connected to the FNAF 4 nightmare rooms. As well as that, if you type in 1983 in the keypad on sister location's private room, you get camera footage of the FNAF 4 rooms. So we can conclude that the nightmare animatronics were created by William for these experiment chambers, likely to create remnant or emotional energy for the fun times. But the gameplay of FNAF 4 doesn't actually take place in one of these chambers. It's actually much more likely FNAF 4 is a nightmare that Michael Afton is going through during or after the events of FNAF 1. I know it's kinda confusing, but it's possible Mike went through these chambers and is having nightmares about them years later, explaining why you can hear the FNAF 1 phone guy call in the background of the game, which is a sound Crying Child couldn't have heard, or why the gameplay is so similar to FNAF 1. The survival logbook, which we know is owned by Mike, also has multiple references to FNAF 4, most notably a drawing of Nightmare Fredbear made by Mike in the page asking for a recent dream. So now that we know the truth about the Nightmare animatronics' identities, what other lore are they hiding? The Nightmare versions of the core 4 members of the Freddy band don't have many ongoing theories revolving around them, except for Nightmare Freddy. Now, I don't think anyone else has brought this up, but Nightmare Freddy has 3 Freddles with him at all times, and they could represent the 3 Afton kids, Michael, Elizabeth, and Crying Child. Nightmare Freddy is also the only one of the core 4 nightmares to appear in Ultimate Custom Night, Afton's personal hell, further strengthening the connection between the two. Nightmare Freddy's UCN voice lines also seem to indicate that they're linked. "I have always been hiding in your shadow" implies a further connection between the two, almost as if Nightmare Freddy is a dark reflection of William Afton. But anyway, he's the only one of the 4 original nightmares that I think has any possible lore hints tied to him. Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare, however, as I said earlier, have a much bigger presence in the lore and more stuff to theorize about. It's a pretty common theory that Nightmare is a representation of death itself going after the Crying Child. But since we just established that the player character can't be the Crying Child, who is this? A pretty interesting theory posits that Nightmare's Crying Child's spirit trying to communicate to Michael, and that Nightmare Fredbear's Cassidy. This kinda requires the Golden Duo theory to be true, since that would explain why these spirits appear as variants of Fredbear or Golden Freddy. I think it's pretty likely the spirits inhabiting the FNAF 1 animatronics are entering Mike's dreams, similar to the FNAF movie. It also explains why Nightmare has a brain-like shape in his head. Even though it's almost definitely his endo head, it looks a lot like a brain and connects the character to Crying Child's death. Nightmare Fredbear and Nightmare also appears as a duo in Ultimate Custom Night, so there's that too. However, the UCN voice lines don't really connect that strongly to these characters, so who knows, maybe it's not true. Plushtrap is a pretty interesting character. His FNAF 4 room is also linked to the sister location bunker via the Breaker Room map, being directly connected to Ballora Gallery. But here's the thing, on that same map are a series of square dots in each of the rooms next to Plushtrap. Across the rest of said map, these dots represent different animatronics, such as Fredbear and Spring Bonnie in the diner, Nightmares in the bedroom, and so on. So, does this mean there are 5 Plushtraps? Not really. In the Help Wanted version of the Plushtrap minigame, we can find a rare Easter egg that shows 4 mini-arenas poking out of the exact rooms the dots are on. Remember that this minigame room is connected to Ballora Gallery, the home of Ballora and her mini-arenas. This is super interesting and is further evidence to the idea that Afton had these nightmare chambers connected to his bunker. Now I want to talk about the Halloween Edition characters, because they're probably some of the weirdest FNAF characters when it comes to canonicity. When the Halloween edition of FNAF 4 came out in 2015, Scott was, for once, very quick to announce the canonicity of the expansion. It was not canon in the slightest, and neither were any of the characters. However, this changed pretty quickly with the release of Ultimate Custom Night and fairly shortly after, Help Wanted. In both of these games, the Halloween edition characters were present, with Jacko Chica, Nightmare Mangle, Nightmare Yon, and Nightmare Balloon Boy being present in Ultimate Custom Night, and both Jacko Bonnie and Chica being included in Help Wanted alongside Nightmare Yon. So if these characters are non-canon, what are they doing in these games? Well, we know the first 6 FNAF games exist as in-universe video games made by Fazbear Entertainment. They're not the exact same as our versions of the games, but they're pretty similar. So if the indie dev that made FNAFs 1 to 4 was in the process of making a Halloween edition, it makes sense that Fazbear Entertainment would reuse those characters for their VR game. The same explanation can be used for the presence of the other nightmares as action figures in the game. As to the reason these characters are in Ultimate Custom Night, it falls down to 2 options. 1, Scott wanted to give them more representation in the games and put them in UCN, or 2, these Halloween edition characters were the illusions one of the kids Afton planted in his bunker were having. Remember that it's likely these monsters look different for every single kid Afton put in his experiments, since the illusion gas messed with your mind and didn't have a set form that it gave to the objects it influenced. However, there's one Halloween edition character that became a huge part of the modern lore that's confused a lot of theorists, Nightmare Yon. In Security Breach, you can find a bunch of Nightmare Yon plushies and staff bots with Nightmare Yon face paint scattered across the Pizzaplex, as well as black and white puppet-like wires. I think this Nightmare Yon imagery is another branch of the mimic or glitch trap code infecting the Pizzaplex, rather than the return of Charlotte Emily or anything like that, because William has a strong connection to his nightmarish creations and Nightmare Yon is all over Help Wanted, meaning the mimic code in glitch trap could take on the form of said animatronic while taking over the programming of the Pizzaplex building. It's also possible this is the game's version of the storyteller from the books. It's also worth bringing up that it's weird how Nightmare BB and Nightmare Mangle are in FNAF 4 when the whole game contains nightmare versions of characters that existed around 1983, with BB and Mangle being from 1987. While this can be chalked down to the expansion being non-canon, I think it's much more likely these particular creatures are created from Mike's memories of his neighborhood, with the mangled Foxy toy in his sister Elizabeth's bedroom becoming Nightmare Mangle, and the boy with a balloon outside possibly becoming Nightmare Balloon Boy. But maybe I'm overthinking it, I don't know. So basically, the Nightmare animatronics are pretty interesting lore-wise, and some of them hide pretty cool lore and implications, like Nightmare Freddy, Plushtrap, Nightmare Fredbear, and so on. They're essentially created by these illusion gas-filled chambers and later become deeply connected to Michael Afton, constantly appearing in his dreams. They're pretty cool characters that have a surprising amount of relevance even later on in the franchise, as seen in Help Wanted and Curse of Dreadbear. With speculation out of the way, I'll ask the same question I ask at the end of my Phantoms video. What is my favorite out of the animatronics we discussed today? My favorite animatronic from the base game of FNAF 4 is probably Nightmare Bonnie or Nightmare Foxy. They both have really cool designs and are criminally underrated. As for the Halloween edition, I've gotta go with my boy Nightmare Yon. He kinda looks goofy, but he's got a great design overall, great voice lines in Ultimate Custom Night, and larger lore significance as I just discussed. Great character and definitely in my top 10 of the franchise. And with that, those are my 3 best FNAF 4 theories. I hope you enjoyed this little compilation video, and if you did, please tell me if you want to see more of these on the second channel. Next week's upload should be a normal video on Into the Pit, and I promise I'll try not to do anything like this ever again for the main channel. But regardless of that, yet again, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Woodard Circle, the Midnight Theorist.